A warm welcome to the channel. My name is Sydney Winston. This is lecture number 8 in the 36th lecture series by Dr. Charles Mathewes of the University of Virginia. The lecture series is on evil. Today's lecture number 8 is The Inevitability of Evil by Irenaeus, and I suggest that we should just get it.
Hello again. So far, with the exception of Plato and Aristotle, we've mostly looked in this lecture series at approaches to understanding and thinking about and responding to evil that are less directly theoretical, more concrete, more literary, more mythological, more scriptural. With this lecture, we're going to move into a series of attempts by thinkers to offer a distinct interpretation, each of them offering their own account, more or less, of what the meaning of evil is, where it comes from, and what humans can do about it. Christian theology, in particular, has a tradition of attempting to offer what have come to be known as theodicies, theories of evil, accounts of evil, that make it intelligible, make it understandable, how we can affirm the existence of a good, all-powerful God in the face of the reality of evil. Now, this word theodicies, let me say something about this for a second here. This word theodicy actually is not invented right early on in the tradition. The word itself comes very late. It comes with Gottfried Leibniz in the late 17th century. We'll look at him and his work later. But from the coining of the term by Leibniz, people began to see that much earlier in the tradition of especially Christian thought, a lot of thinkers had been generating things that looked roughly like theodicies. And in fact, in the history of Christian thought, there have been several distinct, you could call them families, of such theodicies, right? Lots of versions of basic prototypes of certain kinds of theodicies. Two in particular have been very, very powerful. The Augustinian tradition of theodicy, thinking about evil, and the Irenaean tradition of theodicy. Now, in this lecture, we're going to look at the Irenaean theory, the Irenaean theodicy. In the next lecture, we'll look at the Augustinian. Why is it that Christian theology in particular has generated this kind of intellectual practice? Christian theology is relatively unique, not just in the West, not just in comparison to Islamic or Jewish thought on evil. In fact, it's pretty unique all around the world. There's not a lot of direct and serious philosophical thought in Buddhist thinking, in Hindu thinking, in Shinto or Confucian thinking about the nature and origin of evil. There's thinking about it in all those traditions, it really is. But nonetheless, none of them seem to have the same fixation on returning to the problem of evil. For none of them, that is, the problem of evil is quite as problematic as it is for Christians. I think there's two reasons for this in the basic Christian narrative that it's worth our while keeping in mind. First of all, Christians, like Jews, basically because they come out of the tree of Jewish tradition here, Christians, like Jews, say God is wholly in charge of the world, right? The world is cosmically under God's sovereign control. That's one thing that Christians really affirm with Jews and actually with many other traditions. Many other traditions affirm a basic moral order to the cosmos. But what makes Christians distinct from Jews and other people, and in some ways unique, and we'll see Nietzsche complains about this a lot at some point in the future, one of our future lectures, What makes Christians distinct is that they say that the world is really much, much worse than we might initially think it is. That is, the world that we live in is really far more profoundly sunk in evil than our ordinary experience of the world suggests that it might be. Now, that's an anomalous thing to say. Let me stop and pause on this for a second, too. Because one of the things you'll hear Christians saying is that, famously, Reinhold Niebuhr, someone we'll talk about later, said that the doctrine of original sin is the only empirically confirmable doctrine in Christian thought, right? In other words, it's the only doctrine among the many things Christians are supposed to believe about the unity of God, the Trinity of God, the godliness of Jesus as the Son of God, the various things that Christians are supposed to believe. The one thing, Niebuhr said, that everyone can basically see by looking around them is that humans are really screwed up. Well, actually, and I love Reinhold Niebuhr, really, there's a much more complicated story here. In fact, it seems Christians really cultivate a certain perception of sinfulness and evil and corruption in the world, and they need to do that. Why? Again, I think it goes back to what I was saying about the New Testament in the last lecture. What's going on in this text is that as the experience of Christ is processed by the early Christian community, the growing recognition of the magnitude of Christ's saving work is so powerful that it actually requires us to revisit our assessment of the corruption of the world. And in doing that, it allows us to rethink and deepen our sense of the sinfulness of the world as we see it. Among the most important of the thinkers, the earliest thinkers, in fact, in some important ways, the earliest thinker to really begin to systematize Christian thinking about good and evil, and in fact, the whole Christian narrative, is the great early Greek-speaking and Greek-writing Christian theologian Irenaeus of Lyon in France. Irenaeus offered a remarkable and profoundly influential discussion of the nature of evil, sin, and the ultimate vindication of God's goodness in the Last Judgment. But as I said, Irenaeus was a Greek speaker who lived in Lyon in Roman France. Well, that's an interesting story, and he does have an interesting story. In fact, he was born in Smyrna on the Aegean coast of Turkey. The city is now known as Izmir in Turkey, into a Christian family, probably between 120 and 140 AD, roughly speaking. And he died. He was not martyred. He died, which is relatively unusual for a bishop of his time, as Bishop of Lyon around 200 AD. We roughly know his dates. He's certainly an historical figure. And he seems to have heard and seen Polycarp, a disciple of John the Evangelist, before Polycarp was martyred. And so Irenaeus is understood as a kind of chain in a link in the chain to the apostolic era. That is, he saw someone and heard someone who was one of the disciples of John the Evangelist, which is a pretty impressive thing. That's pretty high street cred for a theologian, right? He's the earliest recorded witness we have to the canonicity of the four Gospels. That is, to the idea that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and only those four Gospels that the Christian churches in the East and in the West now recognize as canonical, are in fact the four canonical, the four authoritative tellings of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. As he published his writings, they were immediately recognized to be foundational to the Christian faith and used throughout the Mediterranean world and even into the East. Because at this point, actually, much of Christianity in Irenaeus' time was east of the Mediterranean in the Palestinian coastal areas, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, even into Iran. Right? There were early Christians in India. It's only after the Islamic eruption of the 7th and 8th centuries that you get Christianity moving more westward. But anyway, Irenaeus is generally thought to be the first truly great church father, the first great patristic. That's the term for him. His greatest work is called the Against Heresies, and it's the first really vast and ambitious Christian theological account of the universe and God and the human's place in the universe before God. And in all sorts of ways, it has set the terms of later Christian speculative theology far more profoundly than it is easy for any of us to realize. It would have been possible, for example, for someone not well versed in philosophy, not as able to speak philosophically and abstractly as Irenaeus was, to have first explained and given an account of Christianity. And in that case, the future of Christian thinking would probably have been very, very different. He's also important because as part of this first attempt to articulate the logic of Christianity in a systematic way, it's an attempt that is proposed, as the title of his book suggests, against. There was an opponent he was worried about. And the opponent is a shadow of Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity, of what becomes known, let's say, as Orthodox Christianity. And that shadow is Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism deserves its own lecture series, and it's an enormously complicated and powerful system of thought in its own way. Here, for the perspective of these lectures, let me just say very briefly a couple things about it. Gnosticism was, in important ways, a kind of pseudo-philosophical movement, a very popular movement, especially among elites in the ancient Mediterranean, late antique Mediterranean world. And it argued in important ways that materiality, the materiality of the world, is the source of evil, and that humans, in their true essence, are actually inner spirits that need to be unlocked from their cages of flesh and allowed to escape. Now, this is an interesting account, right? Gnosticism then seems to suggest a couple different important things. First of all, it seems to suggest that the true human essence is an innocent speck of purity inside a cage of flesh, right? So the materiality that surrounds us, that is evil, is in some ways hurting us. Humans, the true essence of humans, is not to be a wicked person or an evildoer, but in some sense to be victims. Secondly, it suggests the solution to this problem is, in fact, to escape materiality, to get out of the world. And certain radical Gnostics, in fact, simply became what were called enlightened people and starved themselves to death. Right? Irenaeus was, if not the earliest, one of the earliest, and certainly the most profound of the earliest Christians to argue that Gnosticism was, in fact, a profoundly mistaken way of being a human. And as the 1st and 2nd centuries moved on and Christianity became more of a live option for people in the Mediterranean, the Gnostics began to say, our interpretation of Christianity is the right one. Christianity is actually a kind of Gnosticism. Now, the Gnostics could do that only on one important condition. And the condition was that Christianity had to be understood as not a continuation of the Jewish story, but as a radical renunciation of it in several different ways. First of all, because the God of Genesis clearly says that creation is good. So the Gnostics had to say, that was not a real God. That was, in fact, Satan masquerading as a God. Secondly, the Gnostics have to say that Jesus did not, in fact, suffer and die on the cross. Jesus, in some sense, faked his own death. Right? The Gnostics were the first kind of conspirator theorists, right? They were the 1st and 2nd century versions of JFK conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. Jesus wasn't really killed up there. He faked it. Well, for someone like Irenaeus, the threat of the Gnostics is profound in several different ways. First of all, it's profound in how it threatens the Christians' vision of how they should live in the world. Secondly, it threatens the Christians' vision of who their ancestors were and who their rivals are in this world now. Irenaeus and the mainstream of Orthodox theology in the Christian world basically said, we are part of the story of the people Israel. Right? We may offer a new version of that story. And Irenaeus can be fairly accused of a bit of supersessionism, right? Of saying that the Christians are the proper inheritors of God's favor because the Jews have rejected Jesus. That's what's called supersessionism. And Irenaeus seems to be an example of that, at least an early example. But that's not his main point. He says that sort of thing because it seems to me anyway, and to other scholars now, he's more fundamentally philo-Judaic. That is, he's more fundamentally trying to identify himself and his tradition with the history of the people Israel, and thus allow that what the Christians call the Old Testament is in fact an authentic story of God's dealings with humanity. Now, remembering that the Gnostics had actually said that the entirety of what the Christians call the Old Testament, the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, was not in fact a divinely inspired text, but a demonically inspired text. Imagine what would have happened if, in fact, Gnosticism had become the orthodox version of Christianity, right? The bloodiness of that picture, the ugliness of the anti-Semitism would be astonishing. Now, Irenaeus, in general, posits a picture of evil as an inevitable and necessary component of the development of the human race. He explains this, in fact, by offering one of the first theological interpretations of Scripture, by telling the story of humanity as the story of Jonah in the belly of the whale, as an allegory for the human fall. Just as Jonah had to be swallowed by the whale, so must humanity succumb to sin, fall into sin, and receive its punishment, namely suffering and death. Then God will raise the dead, and having passed through this evil journey, humanity will have learned by experience what evil truly is, how horrible it is, and how mercifully and blessedly God has acted in redeeming humanity from it. To be blessed, that is, Irenaeus suggests, one must know what it is to be damned. As Dante will suggest later, you've got to go through hell to get to heaven. Now, more theoretically, Irenaeus' picture is relatively simple. First of all, in Eden, Adam and Eve were not fully mature creatures. God initially created them as immature, childlike in their innocence. The human needs over time to grow and mature, and not only over their individual lives, but over the course of human history, in order to become fit for the destiny that God intends, which is union with the divine, communion with God, and growth into the perfect likeness of God. This is a matter in complicated ways of transforming our desires from immediate material desires for base natural ends to a desire for genuine union and communion with God. Now, that transformation may sound like Irenaeus is giving something to the Gnostics, but he's not actually. He's saying that we would eat, we would feast in paradise, but it would be spiritual pleasures that are central to our lives. Now, what happens is that humanity's rebellion against God and descent into sin and evil turn out to be crucial, so to speak, essential for the fulfillment of this destiny. We learn what it means to be transformed by experiencing the pains we inflict upon ourselves, by trying to be sated, by trying to be happy, wholly with the goods of this world. That's what Adam and Eve effectively did. They were not wrong in thinking they could be like God, but they thought they could be like God simply by eating material things. That was their mistake. Now, it's important to notice that Irenaeus is really the first thinker, at least in the Christian tradition, to offer an account of evil that divides evil into two groups. And this will be really important for us as this tradition goes forward and moves into a more philosophical vernacular as well. There's natural evil, those evils that are caused by nature, by accidents of nature, mudslides, earthquakes, plagues, things like that. And then there's distinctly moral evil, evils caused by intentional human will, even if that intentional human will is manifest in some accidental way. A person who is trained in their driving to be talking on the cell phone all the time and accidentally hits someone because of that bad habituation into talking on the cell phone has done a morally evil thing. It's not a pure accident, right? They had to discipline themselves in certain ways to not care about being so attentive to the road. Those of us who drive on highways know about these dangers very much. The experience of moral evil is in some ways the centerpiece of what we take to be human malice. It's what humans cause one another through their freely willed actions, whether directly through their freely willed actions or indirectly through habituation in certain ways. Malice, jealousy, hatred, partiality, pride, these sorts of dispositions and the behaviors that spring from them are moral evil. Irenaeus wants to say that the moral evils we fall into after the fall hurt us as much as those people that we hurt. And in doing that, they slowly cause us to realize the suffering world that we are under. And eventually, he thinks, we will freely choose to turn to God and find our end in the divine. God will not compel us in this. God will simply continue to offer us salvation, and the deeper we get into despair, the more attractive the offer of redemption will come to seem to us. Despite the fact that we do our damnedest, literally, to condemn ourselves to hell, Irenaeus strongly insinuates we will nonetheless finally find God's mercy so powerfully attractive as to be impossible to resist. Now, Adam and Eve's sin, then, lay in their attempt to grasp more than they were ready for in Eden. It was a sin, really, of impatience. But it was foreseeable, because after all, youth is impatient. Age and wisdom are patient. It's only after you have hurt yourself by being impatient that you learn the wisdom of patience. By experiencing life outside of God's plan, humanity then comes to grow and appreciate what God has in store for it. At one point, I talked about this as something like the rebellious teenager theory of evil. And it's not clear, but certainly in some sense, Irenaeus had had enough experience with children. It's not clear if he had children of his own, but he had enough experience of children to know what was going on in their rebellions. On this account, the world is a veil of soul-making. Natural evil has a purpose in this picture. It trains us to feel compassion and to help one another. And the death that is part of natural evil, the death that is part of our mortality in this fallen world, is a good thing because it ends the suffering and puts us to sleep so that we can be resurrected by God. This is a powerful, powerful vision. But there are two things about it that need more reflection. First, consider the deepest insight I think this account has. I said it before. To be blessed, one must know what it is to be damned. Is that true? I don't know if it's true. I think it harkens back to a very old pattern we've seen already in Job and others that suggests that suffering is in some important way core experience that teaches us the kind of wisdom which enables us to be in the right position to be redeemed by God in this tradition. But is that true? I don't know. It can sound like a bad consolation to some people, especially in certain situations where suffering may be just too great for them, right? This account, which seems to begin with Job, can very quickly move into being one of Job's consolers again, right? You could imagine Irenaeus sort of saying to Job, well, you're on the way to learning all the good things that God has in store for you by suffering in this way. I don't think Job would like that. And that touches on the second challenge. Consider one deep question this account struggles to answer. Does it trivialize the reality of evil and suffering, or force all evil and suffering to seem like it's ultimately for our good? Is this true to our experience of evil? What about those who suffer horrendous evil without, at least in this life, seeming to have a chance to learn from it? Some kinds of natural evil may, in fact, teach us not to care about the world in problematic ways. We've all known people who, in the midst of horrible, life-ending illnesses, have become more gentle, more loving, more susceptible of receiving kindness and able to give it. Many of us have been fortunate to know those people. But first of all, that's a very fortunate experience for the people who are dying in that way and for us who are there around them. And there's no way we can say that they ought to be that way, or that they need to be that way, or that if they're suffering, they should be that way. That's not, it seems, fair to me at all. That's a gratuitous and a gracious response by people in situations of extreme evil. But we can't say that that's, in some sense, the standard response of people in extreme evil. Lots of people suffer horribly and die without becoming intrinsically better people from that suffering, at least as far as we can tell. And also, lots of people suffer horribly and die without being able to develop into the kind of people who are like that. Irenaeus, it seems to me, never went into a child's cancer ward, never thought much about the difficulties of infant suffering in this situation. Furthermore, alongside all this, some kinds of evil seem wholly out of proportion to any kind of lesson they could communicate to us, any kind of moral upbuilding that they could enable for us. The classic example of this in the 20th century has been, of course, the Holocaust. Can you imagine how an Irenaean theodicy would account for such gratuitous suffering as 12 million people, a majority of them very aged or very young, those 12 million people dying in death camps? How is that improving their lives in any fundamental way? How can we say with any kind of straight faith, any kind of straight gaze into the eyes of the damned, the dead, that that could be a good thing for them? Well, let's conclude for now. Well, Irenaeus' overall thought had really foundational import for all of Christendom, both Latin and Greek Christianities. His thought about evil has not seemed to have a very powerful influence in Western Christianity. Pretty soon after Irenaeus was alive, only about 200 years later, Augustine's work began to eclipse his vision really quite dramatically. And for most of the history of Western Christianity, most people in thinking about evil have been by and large Augustinians. But Irenaeus' thought was not forgotten. It lay in wait between the covers of books for more than 1,600 years. Some people found it and formulated ideas from it once in a while, but then it emerged again in modified and powerful form in the thought of Hegel and Marx. And indeed, even today, insofar as we ourselves think about our history as progressive, as a school in which we can experiment with certain efforts and see what works and what doesn't, a school that teaches us lessons that we can permanently learn. In short, insofar as we can learn from our mistakes and take tutelage from our suffering, and thus be grateful for the wounds we have suffered, we are in a distant way heirs of Irenaeus. But fully seeing those connections is a task that we will take on many, many lectures from now. Right now, what I want to do is turn to that other great ancient Christian thinker on evil, one of enormous power and influence as well, St. Augustine.
Oh, that was extremely interesting. A warm welcome to all of you who stayed till the end. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm absolutely glued to the screen while watching these episodes, these lectures. I'm loving it. And I hope you are too. Next comes a lecture number 8, I believe. No, lecture number 9. As he mentioned, it's Augustine. It'll be called Creation, Evil, and the Fall. So I'm looking forward to that. I will try, because there's 36 of these guys, I will try and churn them out as often as possible, perhaps even to the point of 2 or 3 a day. If you liked what you saw, I appreciate the likes, the subscribes, most importantly, the share with other people you know. And if you can, throw a few bucks to my PayPal to support the channel. That will go a long way in covering operating costs, plus improvements. Having said that, I think we're done. All gods are